Thank you all for having us here. We're very excited. Um, Heather and I will introduce ourselves a little bit, but to start off, we're just going to be talking about our experiences handling service dogs and sharing what we hope our providers knew and some tips that we think might be useful for you.
Um, we want this to be a conversation. We don't want this to be death by PowerPoint, quote unquote. So if you have questions, we encourage you to ask them in this space. There is not a dumb question. I guarantee you it's one we've heard before. And we would so much rather you ask the question, even if you think it's a little silly or you're a little embarrassed, please ask because these are really important things that we wish more people in healthcare knew, more providers knew. We love educating for the most part, and we do it quite a lot. So, other thing too, just real quickly here, we are not lawyers, we are not doctors, we are not licensed medical professionals. We are experienced service dog handlers who have had a variety of experiences throughout our handling careers. Um, your mileage may vary. Please do not take this as legal or medical advice.
So, some background about me. Um, I grew up in Illinois and I've lived in Washington about 3 years now, and more like four. And so I'm actually an engineer with the federal government, and my dog comes to work with me. I have a lot of background in companion dog training, pets, dog sports, things like that, for over 15 years now. But I haven't really been involved with service dogs until about 2019. And so in that time, I have my current fully trained service dog. I have my old retired one. And then in the middle, I did have a puppy that I was training for a while, but he made it clear that working as a service dog was not for him. So also my experience was working with a program that provided a fully trained dog and a dog that was partially trained that I then completed training with.
So my name is Heather. That's Nora. Um, and I am from Idaho. I've lived in Washington since 2017. I am a care navigator with a local behavioral health agency. So my dog comes with me to work every day. He's got his own bed in my office, and um, everybody has been very accommodating and accepting of him. So I was actually diagnosed with my disability pretty young. I believe I was 22 when I got my first service dog. I'm 32 now for reference. So been a handler for a decade. And then I actually grew up training dogs for hunting with my dad. My dad went bird hunting. Idaho, I know it's a stereotype. I'm sorry. But so I had a lot of training experience just growing up. And so thankfully I was able to kind of apply that experience, just use it in a different way to train all three of my dogs. I've taken some training classes. I've worked with like some private trainers, but all of my dogs are considered owner trained because they did not come from a program. All right. So, some things that we want to answer for you. What is a service dog? And considerations to determine if a service dog is the right tool, rights and responsibilities of service dog handlers in the US, how you can support service dog handlers or people considering a service dog. And like we said, this is a conversation, so make sure you ask questions.
So what is a service dog? Um, as per the American with Disabilities Act, a service dog or a service animal is a dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. Um, Several years ago, they also updated it to say that miniature ponies can also be used in certain cases. Um, and a key thing to know is that there is no certification in the US. So there's no registry. You don't have to have like a specific license or anything like that. Um, and I was really excited to see my local YMCA recently put up a service animals welcome sign. It also recommends people don't touch or speak to animals, and that they ask that people don't bring emotional support animals or pets or anything like that inside.
We have a question in the chat, and
Yeah.
will you please define the term service dog handler? Is that the person the dog is trained to support?
Yes, so that's a really good question. So, typically the handler would be the person that um, the dog is task trained to assist with their disability. But you also can have cases where if somebody isn't able to manage handling the dog themselves, like a young child, then a handler could be like a parent or somebody, a guardian that's able to manage the dog, direct the dog to do assistance, handle the leash, things like that. And so the handler is whoever's managing the dog, but in a lot of cases it
I
can be
would
the
say
same person.
95% of the time it is the person that the dog is trained to support, the owner, the handler.
Mhm.
We use handler because, well, I won't speak for you, but I like the term handler because yes, I technically own my service dogs, but it's such a partnership and it's such a different relationship than having a pet dog that it
Mhm.
feels very weird for me to say, yeah, I'm his owner. That's just a personal preference thing, but I do notice a lot of handlers will prefer the term handler over owner.
Yeah. Mhm. And so a lot of people come across different types of animals that provide assistance. Um, in the US, we have service animals, emotional support animals, and therapy animals. And so I wanted to give a little bit of overview up front so we're all using the same terminology. And so service animals are specifically trained to do work or tasks that mitigate a person's disabilities. Um, Emotional support animals are not trained. They're essentially pets that provide comfort to somebody merely by being themselves. They're not trained to do anything. Um, Therapy animals are trained and they're allowed out into public spaces with invitations, so like going to a hospital, but they're not trained to specifically help an individual. They're trained to interact with the general public, so patients at a hospital, for example. And so therapy animals and emotional support animals do not have access rights to go out in public with the person working with them. Therapy animals have to be specifically invited by the organization. And so a lot of times they work with a specific organization, but they do require certification. So service animals can go anywhere in public with their handler. Um, there's some exceptions, but we'll talk about those a little later. Um, and ESAs and service animals can both live in pet-free housing because they're both considered assistance animals. Um, but in the past, emotional support animals were allowed on airplanes, but they no longer are. Service animals are allowed, and we've got some photos of cute dogs on planes. Um, and the key thing is that service animals and therapy animals are extensively trained to work in novel environments. Loud noises, people yelling,
Kids,
kids, weird things
we
happening.
we ask our dogs to do a lot of things that a typical dog would not be able to do.
Mhm. So, yeah.
So with that, I just want to chime in because I work in the mental health field. I've worked in the mental health field off and on for the last 10 years. And it's a very it is a little bit of an issue because a lot of people will bring emotional support animals into their therapy appointments. And depending on the facility's policy, that may or may not be okay. However, as a facility, something that needs to be thought about is okay, how do we manage, because the service dog handlers have legal rights, emotional support animal owners do not. So how do we manage that? How do we make sure that everybody stays safe? How do we make sure that all of the dogs are behaving? Because as Nora said, an emotional support animal can be any kind of animal. So somebody could be bringing in a cat, for example. And with that as well, with people being able to bring in different animals in a healthcare setting, at least, something else that a lot of people don't think about are how do we mitigate cultural differences, cultural awareness, because there are, just for an example, there are some cultures that believe that cats are like an unclean animal or an unholy animal. How do you mitigate that? How do you make sure that they feel comfortable, but the person with the cat also feels comfortable? So there's just a lot of things that go into bringing an animal with you that isn't thought about. And I've been a handler for 10 years and I'm still learning new things all the time about, oh, I never would have thought about that. But just being in the environment that I work in, it can be a lot. And a lot of times service animals and therapy animals, people will use those words interchangeably because they're not understanding that they're two different things. So a therapy animal, they're the dogs you see that are in the hospitals, in the nursing homes, in the libraries, and they provide just emotional comfort to a wide range of people, but they have a very, very specific set of rules that they follow for everybody. Whereas a service animal has specific sets of rules that they follow for one person, essentially. Like Nora's service dog could not fully support me in the way that I need it. Mine could not fully support her in the way that she needs it, just because they're very, very individually trained.
There's a question. Do you know when they changed the rule regarding the ESAs on airplanes?
I believe it was 2021.
Would you be able to give an example, Nora, maybe like the one you gave me about a scenario where someone is getting support and how it would look from an ESA versus how it might look from a service dog?
Good question. So, diagnoses don't really matter when getting a service dog, but somebody that has anxiety, for example, would be, or difficulty getting up in the morning would be a good example. With an ESA or a service animal would be a potential tool. And so for me, my dog comes over and tries to get me out of bed in the morning just because he's hungry. He wants me to feed him. That's the only reason he's doing it. A pet dog might do that. And so for an ESA, having a routine, having that commitment to care for an animal might be enough to help them. And so in that case, it would be an ESA. But if you're specifically task training an animal to respond to an environmental cue, such as an alarm going off in the morning, and then they paw and paw and paw at their handler until the handler gets out of bed, that would be considered a task-trained animal. And so if that task mitigates the handler's disability in any way, that would be considered a service animal. And so being able to tease out the nuances of whether this is something that an animal's trained to do, or just naturally some behavior that an animal has, that would be a big difference between those. And I think it's important to understand that ESAs can be incredibly valuable, but they also don't have public access rights. And so making sure that people are aware of those. And it's also a big commitment to have a service animal.
It is definitely, and service animals take a lot of extensive training, whereas emotional support animals don't technically, they don't have to have any training at all. And therapy animals, they do have to have training, but it's a very different set of rules that they're working with versus what a service animal works with. And so it's essentially about intention, I think, where if, for example, my current service dog is trained to get my emergency medication when I ask him to. Now, that's not to say that like a pet dog couldn't go and grab the med pouch and I guess bring it to me, but it wouldn't be something that I have trained that dog to specifically do to help me manage my medical condition. So I hope that makes sense. Did that clarify?
Another thing I wanted to point out is if I get a dog that's trained to do diabetic alerts, I don't need those tasks. They would not be beneficial for me. So I couldn't take the dog out in public and say, this is my service dog, because even though he might be task trained to do a certain assistance, that would not actually be mitigating my own disability. And so he wouldn't fall under the ADA rules for public access.
Yeah, that's a good point,
Mhm.
for sure. So, dovetailing right into this, how do you know if a dog is a service animal? So the two questions that businesses are allowed to ask, is this dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? You cannot ask for certifications for paperwork because there is none in the US. Some states will have voluntary registrations, but there is nothing federally that has a registration in the US. All of the things that you see online, register your animal as a service dog, pay $300 and get this licensed service dog, that they're all scams. And it's unfortunate because there's such a lack of education that a lot of people who genuinely do need this tool and need help, but just don't know where to start, can kind of get taken for a ride. And sometimes they're out $300. And, um, the people, primarily the population that I work with, they are low income on a fixed income, et cetera, where they don't have that. So sometimes it will be, they didn't go to the doctor, they didn't get enough groceries or something because they were trying to do this. And so it's just it can get very complicated very quickly. The lovely dog that you see in that picture is my current service dog. His name is Backup. He is a standard poodle. Um, and this is him in a puppy cut. He's in his big boy cut now. Um, but he is a standard poodle, and this is him in my office hanging out with me and just doing his thing. He's just looking cute and paying attention to me.
All right. So, we wanted to share a little bit about, is there a question?
Oh, yeah, there's a question. How do you know that a dog is trained by legitimate trainers?
Good question.
That's a great question. I guess the long and short answer is you really don't, unless you were to sue that person and take that person to court. Um, like the handler, you sue the handler and take the handler to court. Essentially, because owner training is permitted. So what makes a legitimate trainer? I'm not licensed. I don't have any type of professional certification. I just have a lot of experience with this. So, does that mean I'm not a legitimate trainer? Am I legit? So there's so much that goes into that answer. And I guess the best way, and Nora, jump in if you feel like you can add or correct, but is just going by the dog's behavior. A service animal should not be barking continuously. It should not be growling. It should not be lunging. Essentially, the goal that we both have and most handlers have, you shouldn't know it's there. That's kind of the rule of thumb that we look for, is you shouldn't know it's there. And that's one of our favorite compliments to get was, oh, there was a dog there the whole time. Oh, I didn't know there was a dog there. And that's kind of the goal, is that you shouldn't know that they're there. Now, obviously, if we have to have our dog respond, if there's a medical thing, yeah, then people are going to know that, there's a dog there. But it shouldn't be because of a dog's behavior that attention is drawn to it. They should be just pretty much laying very quietly at your feet, just chilling out and being able to be in different environments and not be disruptive. Like,
And in public spaces, that falls under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And to kind of summarize it, it doesn't say anything about training requirements. It says that the animal must be housebroken, non-disruptive, and task trained to mitigate their person's disability. And so it doesn't say how long a dog has to be trained or what skills it has to have or who has the training.
It just has to have the 2 tasks.
It just one task now.
Oh,
So
did they
I
change
think,
it?
I don't think it ever said. I can't remember.
Okay.
But yeah, and it doesn't say you have to have a certain number of tasks. I know there is kind of a organization, service dog organization, like umbrella organization that does its own public access test that does require 3 tasks. But for federal law, it just says non-disruptive. And so that's kind of a good measure is if they're not causing a problem, um, that's about it.
There's a question of, are you guys gonna talk about writing ESA letters?
We are going to touch on that
Mhm.
later. Yep.
Perfect, thank you.
So, what does my dog do for me? It's generally up to the individual handler's comfort to what they disclose. And so if somebody from a business asked me, is this a service dog? I respond, yes. And what task or work does your dog do? I usually just give an example of retrieve to drop item because that's something that the general public can visualize and they know what that looks like to them. Um, but I'm very open that my dog does cardiac alerts, and he provides mobility assistance. And so over the years, this is a photo of Captain James T. Kirk, or Ty for short. Um, he is alerting me that my blood pressure is going up really suddenly. And that can make me dizzy. And so he stares and nudges me. And then I check my blood pressure and like I can lay down and stuff like that. But he also does forward momentum to help me move along when my joints are having issues. He provides deep pressure therapy, retrieves dropped items, and then I've also named like phone, meds, leash, things like that. And so I can just tell him, go across the room, go get my water bottle, and he'll bring my water bottle to me. He also opens up automatic doors, assists me in my wheelchair, closes the fridge, things like that. And so all of those are things that mitigate my disability, either before I have an issue or after. Um, he knows a bunch of tricks that are really cute, but they don't mitigate my disability, so they're not considered tasks.
And then what does my service dog do for me? And that is back up in his big boy cut. Um, so he does, like I was saying, he does emergency medication retrieval. He interrupts undesired behaviors. He does do deep pressure therapy, and where deep pressure therapy is where they will lay on you, and it depends on the handler's preference where they lay on you. Some people like it across their legs. I prefer it across my chest. And that compression, that weight, they kind of act like a weighted blanket where it helps that nervous system. It helps you regulate again, and it kind of calms down that fight or flight response so that you can use your other coping skills to get yourself regulated. If that's something that you are able to do. Sometimes it's just deep pressure therapy can help like with blood pressure, passing
circulation.
out.
Mhm.
For me personally, deep pressure therapy helps with some psychiatric stuff because there are psychiatric service dogs as well. My dog does both. So he's considered a psychiatric service dog because he helps manage some psychiatric stuff. And then he's also considered I guess just regular service dog. I hate using that term, but because I also have physical issues as well that he helps mitigate. So he retrieves dropped items, he opens automatic doors, he can open and close doors with like the lever handles, so not knobs, thank goodness, because this dog is way too smart and we'd get in so much trouble if he could open door knobs, but he can open the lever handle doors and he can close doors. There's other things that he could do that I'm sure that I'm forgetting, but that's just kind of a brief list of what he does. He also does, you know, some pretty cool tricks. He can push a shopping cart. He can play patty cake. He can sit pretty, but those don't help mitigate anything. So those are just the stupid dog tricks. Those aren't considered tasks. And a lot of times it will look like a service dog is not doing anything. A lot of times you'll see them just laying there.
Mhm.
You'll see them dozing. You'll see them just kind of hanging out. And that's exactly what they're supposed to be doing. A lot of times, at least for me, I don't know if you feel this way too, but a lot of times it's because I have my service dog that I don't need to use him.
Mhm.
So he's a safety net essentially, where he allows me to go to a grocery store by myself. He allows me to be independent. He allows me to stay home alone. Does that mean he's tasking 24/7? No. But because I have that reassurance, because I have him there with me, it often means that I don't have as many flare-ups. And because stress can cause flare-ups in a lot of different conditions, I don't have as many flare-ups. I don't worry about it as much because I know he's got me. That's part of why he's named backup.
I tell people it's a lot like a seatbelt. You shouldn't use your seatbelt 24/7. Like it shouldn't have to do its job. But in the moment when you need a seatbelt,
You're real glad it's
you're
there.
glad it's there. And the same for me, like you said, my dog sleeps under my desk at work 99% of the time. He wakes up and stares at me and alerts when he needs to, but then he goes back to sleep.
And oftentimes they won't really be like sleeping. I call it the mom sleep, where they always kind of have that one ear out
Mhm.
and they're paying attention even though they're dozing.
Yes. Mar, I see you have a question.
Yes. I'm curious about if you all happen to know if any other animals can be trained to do like service animal things other than dogs. I just know of a couple of folks that are allergic but would definitely benefit from that. And I know there's hypoallergenic ones, but then those like some people just don't like dogs, which is so fair and fine to each their own. But yeah, I was just curious if you happen to know of any other animals that do that as efficiently.
So legally, uh, federal laws recognize dogs and miniature ponies, but they also recognize that miniature ponies are significantly larger than the average service dog. And so they do stipulate that if businesses cannot accommodate them due to their size, that is not like a legal issue. Um,
Different states can sometimes have individual rules as well about that. I know Oregon will allow pigs to be service animals, but a pig would not be recognized as a service animal outside of Oregon. So right now, dogs are, I mean, primary
Yeah.
that function as service animals.
Mhm.
But yeah, miniature horses, and then depending on the state, pigs in Oregon, and then I'm not aware if any other states allow any other animals. Nothing's coming to mind off the top of my
I
head.
don't know of any other ones. I didn't know pigs in Oregon were a thing.
Yeah.
Cool.
Even we, like we've been handlers for so long, and even we are still learning stuff all the time.
Mhm.
Good
Um,
question.
Yeah. All right. So, did you want to talk about
Yeah.
service dogs and duty?
So service dogs on duty. So this is kind of what our dogs look like when they are working, laying quietly at our feet, not caring about much. This is when we were in the airport, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Nora and I have traveled together a couple of times with our service dogs, and they're ignoring each other very clearly. They're just chilling, and most people don't know they're there.
Mhm. Here I was on the DC Metro with my dog. He curls up in tight spaces all the time.
We're on speaking of tight spaces, we are on a plane here, and so that is back up, curled up at my feet where you'd usually put like a carry-on or something. So he's using my foot as a pillow, you can see there. But yeah, he has to fit in some pretty tight spaces.
A lot of people ask if you buy a separate seat for them, and the Air Carrier Access Act says that they have to fit within your foot space and not encroach on other people's. Otherwise, you do have to.
Yeah, so if I had a Great Dane as a service dog, for example, I probably would need to buy a separate seat.
And here we are in Wallace, Idaho. We found a UFO, so of course we had to get a cute photo.
That's us in the airport. and this was his first time in an airport traveling, and he just took to it like a duck to water. Like he'd been doing it his whole life. He's like, this is fine.
If you've been around Seattle, you know how windy and cold it is on the ferries, but I had to get a photo out there. Neither of us were comfortable. Um, Ty also fits into some pretty tight spaces. If you look closely, you can see him at my feet there. So it was a little tight for my legs, but we had fun.
Yeah.
Here is a picture of my retired service dog. This was like the only one I could find of her alerting. But yeah, basically when she would alert, I would then check my blood pressure to confirm and then give her lots of treats. And then sometimes I would have her lay on my lap to kind of get blood flow back up to my head.
And there's both of our boys. We went to the Seattle Aquarium, and we had to get the picture with the seal.
So many people ask, are they so serious all the time? Do they ever get time off? And they do.
So that's back up at 5 weeks old. That's the day that I picked him. There's certain testing that you can do, which kind of helps you determine which dogs have the best potential to be a service dog. It doesn't guarantee anything, but there are tests that you can do. And so of the dogs we tested in his litter, his mama had 11. It was a big litter. So of the dogs we tested, he showed the highest potential, and he has been absolutely fabulous. But yep, the little backup at 5 weeks old.
Here's Ty curled up on the bed, staring at me.
I'm gonna go by.
And then back up, chilling on the couch. I like to do tricks with my dog. And so he learned how to unroll a yoga mat and do downward dog. Great stretching activities. And then this is Ty with Heather's retired service dog, Mac, and they're good buddies. They hang out together a lot.
They're the grumpy old men.
And then here I am competing in dog sports. So this is something that we do for fun. I'm not aiming for perfect scores or anything. My goal is to qualify and just have fun. And so, yeah, this was our very first competition together.
And there is back giving me, I believe the kids are saying bombastic side eye now. He was very done with my nonsense and was letting me know about it.
And so we go hiking together. I let him wander around sniffing if I don't need him for pulling me up the hills and providing stability and things like that.
So what happens when a service dog retires? Because they do have a limited time to work. Most handlers don't work their dogs their whole lives. There's not a hard and fast rule about that. It kind of depends on the handler. I don't let my dogs work past 10 because I believe that they deserve their golden years and their retirement and just some time to be as much of a dog as they can be. With a lot of service dogs, they really can't turn it off just because the training has to be so thorough and so intense. But giving them a chance to retire allows them to turn that volume way, way down and just kind of be able to relax a little bit more. And there are different things that can happen depending on the individual situation. Some handlers, when their dog retires, they have to rehome it because they can't afford to take care of two dogs. And that's incredibly painful. But it's the right choice for them, and it's the right choice for the dog.
Or they live in no pets housing and they can't.
Yep. So, or they go back to the program that they're from, and then the program will give you a new dog. So those are just some of the examples. I am very fortunate where I have been able to keep my dogs that have retired. So my retired service dog is currently laying in his bed in front of me snoozing. But yeah, so that's kind of some things that can happen when service dogs retire, and it's up to the handler, and it's kind of up to the dog too when they retire, because they'll tell you, they'll let you know when they're tired and when they're ready to be done. They're not showing as much enthusiasm for work, and you can just tell your dog really really well by the time you worked with them,
Mhm.
when they get to retirement age. So,
We have a question in the chat.
mhm.
Um, I don't know if you want to address it now or just sort of save it for later if you have other things that are coming up. But do you have knowledge about resources for people looking to train their own service dogs? Like any recommendations, any cautions for when training a service dog without a professional, um, or without a professional may not be a good fit? And I've worked with people who could benefit, but the cost of a professionally trained service dog is prohibitive.
Yes, I will go ahead and touch on that probably at the end, but
Mhm.
yes, that's an amazing question for sure.
Yeah. And so with my first fully trained service dog, I actually isolated for 12 months when COVID came out. And when we started going back in public, my dog was just like, nope, I don't have the patience to deal with people in public anymore.
And that was a really, really common thing that
Mm-hmm.
happened. The term is washing the dog, where the service dog isn't like age ready to retire, but because of like an injury or a global
Anything.
pandemic, who saw that coming?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't get the practice, they didn't get to use that training, and so they were at home all the time, like we all were,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't have the drive for it anymore.
Yeah. But she's also a Belgian Malinois mix. And so they're very high drive dogs. And I did not have the capability of providing the physical and mental stimulation that she needed if I wasn't working her. And so, going back out in public, I would have to leave her home. And so my program actually was able to place her with one of the people that originally worked with her, who lives on a farm. And so she runs with the horses every day. So,
And
but
here's some
adorable photos.
there's there's Mac being cozy,
This is secret, being cozy again.
and there's my two boys napping together.
It's a secret. She loves being out in the snow.
And there's Mac, how we all feel when we're ready to retire, I think.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question,
Yes.
which is my understanding that fully trained means task trained, good public behavior, and potty trained. Is that correct?
Good question. Yes. So
Pretty much.
that's basically it. To be considered okay, there are nuances. So in terms of public access, um, yes, that's what qualifies. In terms of some people only need a service dog at home. And so having them trained to be out in public is just not necessary. And so in that case, as long as they're doing a task that mitigates their handler's disability at home, that's all that is required. But is a service dog right for me?
So some of the pros, increased independence, like we kind of were talking about. I can go to the grocery store, I can be alone,
Mhm.
all that. We kind of touched on this a little bit, where reducing stress about your medical condition or disability, knowing the dog will, or knowing you have that extra support. Um, it's very, very reassuring, and it can be really hard um, to learn to trust your dog. But once you get there, once you've worked with that dog, once you do build that relationship of that trust, it takes a lot of weight off.
Mhm.
Having a routine can be really, really helpful for people. And this doesn't necessarily this isn't necessarily considered a task.
No.
But just having that routine of, you know, being aware that your dog gets fed at 6 o'clock, and you need to make sure that you're sticking to that, and things of that nature can
Mhm.
just help you stay more on track with yourself. Um, like we said, safety net or seatbelt. I really like
Mhm.
that analogy.
Yeah. And so comfort itself is not a task, but just having an animal um can be really soothing and calming and helpful for a lot of people, but it's not a task. So there's a lot of cons though.
There are. I have actually talked to people, we both have talked
Mhm.
people out of service animals because there are a lot of cons to it. Now, for both of us, the pros outweighed the cons, excuse me. But they're not the right tool for everybody. Just like, a wheelchair, a walker, a cane, they're not the right tools for everybody. It's very individual.
Mhm. And the direct costs are really high, especially for the large dogs. Food is very expensive. Um, Treats, training, things like that. And a lot of people forget these costs add up, um, and indirect costs. So for me, finding flights that will work for me, it may not be the cheapest flight available that I would have taken if I didn't have a service dog, just because of the extra time that's needed to go between flights and things like that. And also for housing. For me, I physically can't take a dog on a walk all the time, so an apartment is not an option for me. So I need to find a house that has a yard so I can let my dog out without me having to physically do all that. And employment. If you need a service dog with you, working in a kitchen at a restaurant would not be feasible.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it would be a lot because the whole thing about accommodations is that they have to be considered reasonable accommodations. And so for a kitchen, a restaurant, not saying it couldn't happen, but there would be so much that would need to happen. Most places I feel would not deem it a reasonable accommodation where they would be put under undue stress to have
Mhm.
that. And there can be discrimination that comes along with that too.
Mhm.
I had I interviewed for a position and I brought my service dog with me and I was very, very qualified for this position and I didn't get it. And I truly do feel like it's because I brought the service dog with me. And a lot of times, there's a lot of online support groups, and a lot of times people will say, do not bring your service dog to an interview if you can avoid it. Because to avoid that discrimination, that risk.
Mhm. I'm actually on the other side of that. I prefer to bring my service dog to interviews because I want to weed out places that are going to be problematic. But I also have the privilege of being able to be more selective about which jobs I take. And usually the types of jobs I do, being in the government side of things, they're a lot more aware of legal requirements that they have to follow.
There's also the physical, mental, and emotional burden of having a dog that
Mhm.
is with you almost 24/7. And there are definitely times where I have had to just ask my husband, like, can you take the boys for a second? Because I'm really overstimulated and I can't be around anybody right now, including my dogs. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen.
Mhm.
But you go into this understanding that their needs come before yours because they take care of you. You need to make sure you're taking care of them as well. So their needs come before yours.
Mhm. I usually tell people it's like bringing a toddler with you everywhere. You
A
gotta
little
make
bit.
sure they drink and they eat and they go pee, and then you have to get them dressed and undressed every time you go into a store. And like if they're having a bad day, you just have to manage them extra carefully or leave them home or you don't go out. Like it's a lot.
I just wanted to pop in really quickly, since so many of us are providers in medical spaces. I have worked with a number of social workers who had service dogs, and I know that specifically related to hospital work or spaces that there may be any sort of contaminants. So that's a place that they were told specifically that is not a reasonable accommodation.
Mhm. And Title I of the ADA covers employment, which is very different than public access. And so that's something I'll talk about on one of the next slides. Mhm. Yeah. There's a lot of questions from the public all the time. So running into a gas station,
There's no such thing as a
it's
quick
not
errand with a
quick.
service dog.
Yeah.
You get stopped a lot. People will oh, there's a dog, oh, there's a dog, oh, there's a dog, oh, there's a dog. We often joke that, you think we had service unicorns with the way people react. And then there's, there's the adults, there's also kids who see a dog and want to go and pet it and interact with it, and sometimes adults do. And
Mhm.
so it can be challenging mitigating that for sure.
Yeah. So, yeah. And like grieving a pet is difficult, but when you have lived with a service dog 24/7 for 10 years, a lot of people compare it to losing a spouse. Like, and even more than that, you depend on them for your independence. And so it can be very difficult with going through the end of life care.
And we bring this up not to put a damper on things, but because so many of you do work, in the medical space, in the mental health space, etc., you're gonna understand that you need to respond a little differently to when somebody tells you, "Oh, I had to put my dog down." That is incredibly sad. It is incredibly hard, and I am not
Mhm.
discounting that at all. But it hits so differently when it is a service animal that you have depended on, that has been your lifeline, that has been your partner in a sense. You have poured so much of yourself into this animal, and they've poured so much of themselves into you. It it was one of the most painful things that I ever had to experience, unfortunately.
Mhm.
So that's why I bring that up, because it's just not talked about a lot, and that is definitely a con to having a service dog.
Yes. Mhm. And so, um, just to kind of summarize some of the laws, as I said, like Americans with Disabilities Act covers employment, state and local government facilities, as well as public spaces. And it explicitly calls out that service dogs, or humans have the right to bring their service dog into public spaces. However, with employment, it doesn't specifically state that service dogs have to be allowed, and so that has to be an interactive process. Um, Ask Jan, the Job Accommodation Network, is incredibly helpful for navigating what would be considered reasonable or not. But generally, um, I work in the office, I work in the field, I go out and do surveying. I um, am out in the heat. And so, like, typically, if it's over about 65 degrees, I don't bring my dog with me out into the field, but otherwise, he is wandering through grasses and chilling in the car, watching me actually do the work. So he goes everywhere. But the Air Carrier Access Act applies on planes themselves. For federal buildings, employment, housing, things like that, that would be covered under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And then the Fair Housing Act actually combines emotional support animals, service dogs, all under the assistance animal umbrella. And it applies for where the handler lives. I bring my service dog to my sister's apartment. I don't have to get special permission from her landlord because the state laws and federal laws and stuff like that protect me as the handler. She does let her landlord know so that they don't freak out seeing a dog there. But yeah, hasn't had any issues. However, federal laws only cover fully trained service dogs. So, um, for example, with the Americans with Disabilities Act in public, housebroken, non-disruptive, and have a task that mitigates their handler's disability. State laws may give additional protections, for example, making it a misdemeanor to harass or harm a service dog. And they may also give public access rights to service dogs in training. So Washington, for example, does not, but
Idaho does.
Idaho does. Um, but I believe only for service dogs in training that provide physical assistance, so not for psychiatric service dogs.
When I lived in Idaho, it was permitted. So I don't know if the laws have changed since then, but but yeah, Idaho does have some protections.
Yeah. And
So what we wish providers knew, differences between emotional support animals and service dogs. an ADA disability definition is not the same as somebody that's applying for Social Security. So that's a really big misconception is that when a provider, a doctor, et cetera, you're talking to them about a service dog and they say, oh, well, if we officially declare you disabled, it's going to make things a lot more complicated. They are under the understanding that it's the same kind of process as somebody getting on Social Security or disability, and it's not. We wish that I'm sorry, Nora, that's
Providers, like, we need letters from providers saying that
okay.
We're disabled, that we meet the ADA definition of disability, and that a service dog is beneficial for us. And so that can be required for employment or housing or to apply for a program. Um, Providers are not taking on responsibility saying that this dog is trained. They're just saying that,
This person meets the
yeah.
qualifications.
Mhm.
So this would be a wild example, but if a service dog caused a hole in the drywall, for example, they wouldn't be able to hold the provider that
Mhm.
wrote that letter accountable.
Yeah. So you're not testing to their training, and also the letter's not necessarily for a specific dog. Um, it's just saying a service dog would be beneficial to the patient.
And part of kind of that cost, insurance doesn't pay for anything regarding a service dog. And I don't know about all states, but I can share that with my personal experience, because sometimes medical expenses you can write them off in your taxes. My when I looked into that, I think I had to have paid like $10,000 in order to write that off. No, I'm not an accountant, so I don't know if that was accurate or not, but that's something to consider as well, is that insurance doesn't pay and you may not be able to write it off in your taxes because your cost of a service dog may not add up to 10,000 in a year.
Mhm.
Um, mhm.
There's a question of just like, is that a similar letter for ESAs?
Yes and no. ESAs are just for the Fair Housing Act.
Mhm.
It's not as wide spread, I don't think. The terminology would be, I think, very similar where, you know, I provider feel that Heather would benefit from an emotional support animal, please accommodate this. I actually think that's pretty close to, because I've had an ESA before. So that's pretty close to what the provider wrote for me. And we'll touch on this a little bit more, but it's becoming more rare to find providers that will actually do that. And
Can I add a quick
yeah.
ESA note too? ESAs, there have been cases where therapists or healthcare providers have been found liable for a misbehavior from an emotional support animal, which I know is why some people have hesitance, but that is a thing to be aware of.
Wow. Interesting, because that's good to hear from somebody that's knowledgeable of that, because from what I've read, is that everything that the providers are doing, and this was a big issue with the Air Carrier Access Act, because we have to fill out a form for the plane, and like
This form is equivalent to getting a loan. It is a lot.
yeah, and so there were issues where vets didn't want to have to sign off on the forms because the forms implied but didn't state that the vet was taking responsibility. Um, and so they ended up changing that, so that was removed because of that misconception. But yeah, that's kind of scary to hear.
That's
I'm
very
sure
scary.
that state by state there's different situations, but it is something that has happened. There have been a couple of therapists who've been found liable in civil court.
That's wild. Because
And it was all the cases I'm aware of were ESAs. I know that the protections are different for service dogs.
Wow.
yeah.
Another question. Do you know which types of providers that can provide that letter? The letter for service dogs.
Medical medical
So
professionals, right?
generally, any medical provider that can like oversee that care. So for example, my primary care doctor's written a letter for me in the past, my cardiologist, my neurologist. Um, but because my dog doesn't do anything for like podiatry, like if I go see my podiatrist, I wouldn't ask them to write the letter because they're not familiar with that need, that part of my disability. Um, but yeah, I've had physician's assistants write them.
I will say quickly that that we are all medical providers. We bill insurance as medical providers, and I've written many related to neurodiversity. So I would imagine that that it would be okay for social workers, therapists, like mental health therapists, as well as like occupational therapists and speech language pathologists who can tie the diagnosis with the need, with the treatment plan, and why the service dog is the best way to get that need met.
Mhm.
It sometimes has been a lot of paperwork for me, depending on what organization I need to like fulfill the requirement for, and where it is. But I've never had any pushback from me being an authoritative source for that.
Yeah. And especially for, a dog that is trained to help with psychiatric stuff, I definitely think that's an appropriate person to be able to write that letter, because if you're treating somebody for panic disorder, for example, and the dog has tasks that help with panic disorder, then that makes sense where your, licensed mental health professional is writing that letter. For sure. Um, we wish providers knew the range of what service dogs are able to do. A lot of people don't know that they're able to help with psychiatric stuff, don't know that they're able to help with vertigo, don't know that they're able to help with POTS. Don't, there's so much that we that they are able to do. And so we definitely wish providers would know a little bit more about the range. And um, would this be several of you have mentioned, oh, I feel like this would be a really good fit for this person. Um, we've never had that happen
No.
at all.
Most access issues I have been with medical facilities.
I've never had a medical professional, or even a therapist, a mental health professional. I've never had them like, oh yeah, service dog would be great for you. Now, mind you, I was 22 when I got my first one, so I was pretty young, but yeah, that's not really something that's common.
No. And so how can you as providers help? One way is just make your facility accessible. So a good rule of thumb is that if a wheelchair can fit, a service dog team can generally fit. And just physical accessibility is big, but also just knowing policies, knowing that if you have a dog that's being disruptive and the handler cannot get the dog back under control, you can ask them to take the dog out. Um, it's really, I feel very safe when I'm asked those two questions that businesses can ask, because it tells me that you know the rules, you know what's allowed. And I also feel like if somebody did bring a dog in and they're like, no, this isn't a service dog, that they would be asked to remove the dog, which makes it safer for me because I don't have to constantly be watching over my shoulder for this dog to make sure that they stay far enough away that they're not going to just like suddenly attack my dog. Yeah.
I have unfortunately had that happen, where I was at my doctor's office. My dog, it was Mac at the time. He was underneath my chair like he was supposed to be. He was doing exactly what he needed to be. And somebody came in with a smaller dog on like one of the flexi leads, and it was barking, and there were kids that were scared of this dog. It was acting really aggressively, and the gentleman set the dog down on the floor, and it beelined for Mac. It went right for him. Now it was on a leash, so it hit that end of its leash. But had the guy dropped the leash, or had I not been able to kind of just close my legs and protect Mac, I don't know what would have happened. And so I actually had to educate my whole doctor's office. I talked to the clinic manager and provided education on that. But and while I'm happy to do that, it goes to the point of, should I have had to? And as far as like accessibility in facilities, some things that kind of aren't thought about, where if you have a service dog handler come in and they need to take their dog potty, is there a specific place you want them to do that? In the wintertime, do you use pet safe de-icer? Those are all questions that I had to kind of figure out with my current workplace, and figure that out. So there's a lot of things that go into accessibility that maybe aren't the first things that you think of.
So yeah, I know we're getting a little short on time. So just to summarize that, service dogs can be amazing tools, but they're also a very individual decision. Sometimes the cons outweigh the pros. But talk to your clients about that. Make sure that they're informed, and that owner training is a tool, and that please ask somebody to remove a disruptive dog. It makes everybody safer, and it is well within your rights. And just overall be knowledgeable on the rules. There's a lot to untangle, but there's a lot of information online.
And the fact that you guys were wonderful enough to ask us to present, that you are engaging, that you are asking these questions, that's half the battle. And we really appreciate everybody being here and engaging and participating, because it really does mean a lot to us that things are changing little by little, but things are changing. We're getting there. So yeah, any questions? I know something that we didn't touch on yet was resources for owner training. So there are a lot of YouTube videos that can be really good. Obviously, the person needs to use their best judgment. Nobody is fact checking YouTube, unfortunately, but YouTube can be a good resource. There are several books on how to train your own service dog. At our local PetSmart, we have an amazing trainer that does some really good classes. So potentially finding a trainer in the community that can work with you and help you can be oftentimes a lot more affordable than a program dog. So there are definitely costs associated with owner training a dog. They're just not nearly what they are for a program dog.
And programs can vary. I mean, a fully trained service dog, if you were going to hire somebody to train them, would be $30,000 to $50,000. A lot of programs do them for free or for $5,000 to $10,000. However, the ones that do it for free typically have 3 to 5 year wait times. Once you are an established client with them, they will prioritize getting a replacement dog when yours retires, but that initial wait time can be just too much for some people.
Yeah. I think that was the only question we didn't touch on. So, any additional questions?
I'm not sure that we have time to unpack all of this. But since we are working with neurodivergent humans a lot of it's sensory overwhelm and nervous system regulation. And so there's just a query for possibly some more info on the benefits of service animals for sensory differences. And if you don't have that on hand, then maybe a resource later.
So yeah, I actually have ADHD, so I am neurodivergent. And one of the tasks that my dog is trained to do, I'll bounce my leg a lot when I'm overstimulated. I know that's a really common thing. I will bounce my leg a lot, and he will actually put his 2 front paws up on my leg and stop it, so that I realize that I'm doing that. I realize I'm overstimulated, and then I have that added contact point of him just touching me. And oftentimes that will help when I am overstimulated, when I am kind of getting that sensory overload. My dog will also touch my hand with the back of his nose, and that will kind of ground me when I am feeling overstimulated, overwhelmed. He'll also lick my hand when I need him to, does the same thing. So those are some examples of tasks that a service dog can help with, as far as, you know, somebody that is neurodivergent that does struggle with being overstimulated and overwhelmed pretty easily.
And also picking a dog that's right for you.
Mhm.
For me, I don't like a dog that's clingy and touchy. Like, I don't like to be touched.
And I need them.
And so, like, what works for Heather doesn't work for me. My dog's a husky. He's practically a cat. He's like, leave me alone. Sometimes I need to have that tactile grounding, and so I will like hold on to his vest when we're in public and things like that. But otherwise, he leaves me alone, and it's great.
And I had to train my dog to accept being hugged, being held, because I need that so
Mhm.
much, especially if I am close to a panic attack. I need that deep pressure therapy. I need to be able to hold on to him. And that's not a natural thing that dogs like. I had to train him to be okay with that and to accept that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we're about out of time, but if people have other questions, Emily has our emails, and feel free to reach out.
So just super quickly, my understanding is people would like some more support and resources related to ESA letters. So if you can send any of that, that would be really lovely. And then also I will send out my sample ESA letter that I've never had any issues with before. But I just want to like thank you so much for all of this. The chat is full of just delight in your presentation and really just a lot of like cooing about the beautiful dogs and all the I really appreciate you taking the time. This is such an unused resource and understanding in our community, and I really appreciate all of this. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. It truly does mean a lot that we were able to speak on this. It's something we're very passionate about because we have to be. It affects our daily lives, and it affects a really big part of our community. Just as service dog handlers, and you know, we would love to present again or answer further questions, etc. And yeah, we'll definitely get you some resources compiled. We're definitely, I think, more knowledgeable on service dogs and ESAs, but we can point you in the right direction for sure. And yeah, thank you guys so
Thank you.
much for being here.